Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this side event called Creating an Indigenous Underclass, the Off-Reserve Educational Experience in Canada, hosted by the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. I'm Rob Russell. I'm the Senior Director of Government Relations with the Congress, and I'm Enoch, and my homeland is Nunatuqavut, and I'm going to be your moderator for this afternoon. Today's presentation will focus on Canada's treatment of non-status and off-reserve Indigenous peoples while they are trying to pursue an education. While the presentation speaks to education in a general way, the focus here will be post-secondary education, and I believe you will find the presentations very interesting. We are hosting this event virtually at the Permanent Forum for the second year in a row. We hope those joining us are well and healthy during what is still a very difficult time for many as a result of the pandemic. I would like to take a few moments just to go over some technical notes to ensure participants have the opportunity to contribute when their schedule allows. The webinar is being recorded. There will be an opportunity at the end of the presentation for comments and questions. If you would like to ask questions live, please click on the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. I will advise when it's your turn to ask a question. When called on, you will be prompted by the host to unmute. Please unmute at that time and ask your question. You may also use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask, type any other questions that you might have. Our presentation will likely run a little over 60 minutes, but depending on questions, and it will be in two parts, one of which will describe our community and the other one will talk more specifically about education in general. And like I said, at the end, you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions. I'd like to introduce our presenters here today. They are all members of our community, the non-status and off-reserve community, and have a very important issues to share with us. And first, we have the National Chief of the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, Elmer St. Pierre, National Chief St. Pierre. Chief St. Pierre will be providing welcoming remarks and an overview of the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples constituency. Following Chief St. Pierre, a National Youth Director and advisor to Native Council's PEI, Bradley Cooper will be presenting on the education system here in Canada and the experience of our community. Chief and President Lorraine Augustine from the Native Council of Nova Scotia will be available at the end of the presentations to help any questions that you might have about education in general. Before we begin the presentation, I would first like to welcome National Elder Diane Langley to offer a prayer and get us started in a good way. Elder Langley, if you're available.
I'm available, but I can't get my camera to come on for some reason. So I guess you're going to, oh, maybe that's it. Nope, tried both ways. Anyway, we'll do the prayer. Start my video. There's a thing that come up. Sorry about that, Robert.
Okay. That's fine. Take your time, Elder. We appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today.
Okay. First, I'd like to thank the different nations for allowing us to meet in this way from their unceded territories. Next, I'd like to offer a virtual tobacco pouch to all on this call to give them strength and understanding. Creator and great grandfather of all, who dwells in every object and every person, we acknowledge your understanding. We humbly ask you to be with us and impart some of your understanding to us during this meeting. Let us have respect for each other and have a successful meeting. We humbly ask that you let it be so. Tahoe. Walare.
Nakomik. Thank you so much, Elder Langley. That was wonderful. National St. Pierre, Chief St. Pierre will now provide some opening remarks, set the context for our discussion today, and provide a presentation on our community briefly. As a community and dedicated chief, he has much insight to share with us about the non-status Métis and off-reserve communities. National Chief St. Pierre, if you would.
Thank you, Robert. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank our Elder Diane Langley for her opening prayers to start us off in a good way. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin people, where I am joining you from today in Ottawa. I want to also acknowledge the territories each of you are on. I'm Elmer Sanker, National Chief of the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, or CAP. I was elected as the National Chief 2020 on the promise of representing our grassroots people. One of the most fundamental issues that is important to us is education and helping pave a better path for our young people. We're looking forward to sharing your stories of education to the Off Reserve community with you. Before we begin the presentation, I would like to tell you about CAP and our communities. To start, this is CAP's version. All Indigenous people in Canada will experience the highest quality of life, but funded on the rebuilding of our nation. All Indigenous citizens will be rightfully treated with respect, dignity, integrity, and equality. CAP is one of the 5 national organizations in Canada. We were founded in 1971 as the Native Council of Canada, before coming the Congress of Aboriginal People in 1993. CAP is the national voice of off-reserve status, non-status Indians, Métis, and Southern Inuit people. Throughout the history of CAP, has been committed, throughout its history, CAP has been committed to address injustice for our people. We serve the national voice of our 11 provincial territory organizations, from British Columbia to the West Coast to Labrador in the East Coast. Throughout our history, CAP has been fighting to address the Indian Act and other practices that have led to the exclusion of our people. CAP is responsible for the CAP Daniel Supreme Court decision, a 17-year-long legal battle. This confirmed that the Métis and non-status are Indigenous under the Constitution. Our people have far too long faced unfairness, hardship on the base of their identity. This is because of the wrong and damaged belief that there are less Aboriginal than our brothers and sisters on reserve. Tragically, the government has been treating us this way, and we are unable to access our rights as Aboriginal people. Thank you for joining us today. I will turn it back to Robert to introduce our National Youth Representative to talk about the post-secondary education experience of our communities here in Canada. Great.
Nagamik, thank you so much, National Chief. Like, I'm constantly amazed at the amount of work the Congress has been able to accomplish after facing so much adversity from so many places. Just to build on what the Chief had already mentioned, CAP came into existence to protect the most vulnerable members of the Indigenous community here in Canada, who are being left out and forgotten because of unjust policies like the Indian Act. Our focus is the need for off-reserve Indigenous people to access services they need, especially for the rapidly growing Indigenous population in urban Canadian communities. CAP's policy focuses on practical issues facing local Indigenous communities such as health and justice, opportunities for youth, housing, and environment. We've always demanded the recognition of non-status and off-reserve Métis and Southern Inuit in the Constitution, as well as for their day-to-day needs. Something confirmed by Canada's highest court after the Congress's legal battle with the Government of Canada. Resulting from this confirmation, we have been seeking a specific relationship for Métis non-status Southern Inuit with the federal government. Unfortunately, the government has been reluctant to move forward concretely on this relationship. It has left our people out of much consultation and engagement and placed us in an even more vulnerable position, by creating Indigenous policy about distinctions that leave our people out. Creating these distinctions are creating barriers to our people getting essential services, healthcare, education, and many other much needed care. A change in approach is definitely needed. One area our community is certainly facing is the crisis in education. Canada's policies are intentionally ignoring the needs of our community to be able to access important educational support needed for our community to be able to move forward. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from our National Youth Representative, Director Bradley Cooper, to tell us what's happening in the community and what needs to be done to ensure the success of our people. Director Cooper, welcome and thank you for being with us today. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Robert. It is a pleasure to be here. With these slides that I'm about to present, I will first offer an apology for the first two slides. In order to provide a solid understanding and shared foundation of education among Indigenous people that we represent, I first need to speak a lot about statistics. Many people might not find the subject matter very entertaining, but it is necessary so that we understand where we are now in order to go to where we need to proceed. So within the education and our people, I would first like to explore the statistics with respect to the Aboriginal population in Canada and our attainment rates for higher education. So the statistics for 2011, which is the National Household Survey Questionnaire, there were 671,400 adults within the adult age range of 25 to 64 who identified as having Aboriginal ancestry. And this represents 3.7% of the total population for adults within this age range. Within these statistics, it's also quoted that Indigenous people are the youngest population in Canada, with about 40% under the age of 25 in 2016, which is compared to 28% of the non-Indigenous population. Of the Indigenous population who are identified, almost half, or 48%, of the Indigenous population had a post-secondary qualification in 2011. This is broken down to 14.4% with a trade certificate, 20.6% with a college diploma, 3.5% with a university certificate or diploma below the bachelor level, and finally 9.8% with a university degree of bachelor or higher. Comparing the almost half or 48% of Indigenous peoples of the post-secondary qualification, this is compared to 64% or nearly 2/3 of the non-Aboriginal population within the same age range that had a post-secondary education. In comparing these two numbers of half for the Indigenous population and 2/3 for the non-Indigenous population, the biggest difference between these two groups is that the Aboriginal population had a higher proportion of Indigenous students with under a university degree level, namely trade certificates or college diploma. Among the Indigenous people who are within the age range, 30% nearly had identified that they had no certificate, diploma, or degree, while for the same age range, 12% of non-Indigenous students identified as having the same no certificate, diploma, or degree. So we see that the percentage is nearly doubled for Indigenous than it is for the non-Indigenous population. And speaking about our students, as the National Chief had mentioned, CAP represents and advocates on behalf of status and non-status First Nations, Métis, and Southern Inuit who reside off reserve across Canada. In the 2016 Census of Population conducted by Canada, there are 1.67 million Indigenous peoples reported within Canada. Of this 1.67 million, 14%, or 233,000, identified as First Nations without Indian status in Canada, what we refer to as non-status. However, it is important to note that this figure for who CAP represents within Canada does not include many of the Métis and Southern Inuit within our PTO constituents. Further, about 150,000 students represented by CAP and PTO affiliates identified as needing or benefit from post-secondary education supports. However, given that Indigenous peoples are the fastest growing population in Canada, especially among youth, growing by 42% between 2006 and 2016, we expect this count of 150,000 students is actually underestimated and may be significantly higher. Further, in 2016, the data does not include children under the age of 15, who as of now in 2022 would be of the age to attend and graduate from post-secondary education institutes. The final messaging I would like to share is that there's a tremendous need for post-secondary education support to help advance our students who have long been underrepresented and underserviced. So, with the statistics out of the way, I would now like to speak to the barriers that are faced by our Indigenous students. There are, of course, many factors and barriers that affect our people in their pursuit of a higher level of education, including both financial and non-financial barriers. Over 16,000 Indigenous students cited the inability to pay as a main barrier to their PSE or post-secondary education completion, emphasizing the need for programming designed specifically for off-reserve Indigenous students. Research also suggests that the current funding levels provided by the government in Canada are well below the demand needed by Indigenous students and is insufficient to support all Indigenous students, which of course speaks to the cause of being financially unprepared as a significant challenge for Indigenous students to encourage PSE success. It's also noted that family-oriented barriers such as being too difficult to move away from home or personal or family responsibilities as other contributing sources to why Indigenous off-reserve students are unable to access PSE completion and availability. Literature also describes that anti-Indigenous racism and systemic prejudice in academic institutions is a significant contributor to impairing equitable access to post-secondary education for Indigenous students. Finally, within the history of Canada, the Indian residential school legacy from family members is a significant negative impact on students obtaining post-secondary education and attainment. Literature also highlights the need to improve student experience of transitioning housing and relocating from their homes as a requirement for attending PSE institutions and ultimately PSE attainment rates. This includes supporting suitable and secure housing availability and access. Moving on, the attainment of higher education must be well incentivized to counteract the ongoing and historical distrust that many Indigenous students carry towards post-secondary education institutions in Canada. Students and families must be well supported, involved, and empowered to build trusting relationship with schools. Parental and familial involvement must be prioritized in the development of programming in order to accurately and sufficiently address their needs and rebuild generations of distrust of education institutes. Government funding mechanisms such as scholarship, bursaries, and grants are well positioned to finance Indigenous students' education attainment. However, research suggests a need to improve funding levels and increase accessibility for Indigenous students. Findings also point to the urgent need for additional support and programming to encourage survivors of the Indian residential schools and their families to obtain post-secondary education outcomes. Outside of financial supports, Indigenous-led and informed after-school, peer mentorship, and in-school cultural and social support programming substantially improves Indigenous students' academic success and achievement. We also need to explore other support services targeting the broader social determinants of Indigenous health, such as physical geographic locations, living in rural or urban communities, as well as housing needs, are also key components to be considered for incentivizing Indigenous students. In speaking about our issues, there are currently no educational support programs that address the unique needs of off-reserve status and non-status Indians, Nunatuka Inuit, and Métis students across Canada represented by CAPS affiliates. This lack of support means that the government of Canada has so far not met its fiduciary responsibility towards Indigenous peoples and CAPS constituents, as reiterated under the 2016 Supreme Court case of the Daniels decision. Canada has yet to implement policies and programs designed to administer post-secondary education funding, resources, or supports for constituents of CAP as is demanded of their fiduciary responsibility. Currently, federal programs offering Indigenous students are based on the government's distinctions-based approach, which most often means that only a select number of Indigenous students are eligible for support based on their affiliation with government-supported organizations. This distinctions-based approach has thus far excluded the students represented by CAP and its PTOs, who consequently do not qualify or are unable to access any of the support programs aimed at Indigenous peoples. Our Indigenous students are being discriminated against due to their Indigenous identity, their choice of organization affiliation, and where they choose to live across their ancestral homeland called Canada. In terms of solutions, simple solutions are not effective. It will require a multifaceted solution, which include financial, social, and individual elements. In an effort to adequately address the barriers you're facing, CAP is proposing a set of 7 resolutions that are by no means the full extent of being able to address post-secondary education attainment within Canada. First, and most importantly, the federal government needs to end their discriminatory policy of distinctions-based programming. It is leading to an underclass of Indigenous peoples who will be permanently and irreversibly impacted by the lack of service and access to their culture. Instead, the federal government must adopt an approach that services the majority of Indigenous peoples rather than only the small fraction that are currently recognized. Second, targeted funding must be developed to ensure off-reserve and non-status Indigenous peoples are benefiting from the programming. This also includes remaking existing funding allotments and programs to be made accessible to our community. Third, Canada must commit to increasing funding levels to ensure it is meeting the needs of all Indigenous peoples. These funding allocations must be developed in the spirit of reconciliation and should ensure equity and access for all Indigenous peoples. Fourth, access to resources for secondary and post-secondary institutions need to be made available to all Indigenous peoples and with respect to the diversity of different Indigenous cultures within Canada, in particular the off-reserve and non-status communities. Fifth, there is substantial need for support resources to develop post-secondary education educators and other personnel within academic institutions to better serve non-status and off-reserve Indigenous students and their diverse cultures. Sixth, programming should respect the rights of Indigenous peoples to pursue an education based on their communities and their own ambitions. They should not be relegated to programming designed to meet labor market needs and not Indigenous identified community initiatives. Seventh, and finally, programming needs to be holistic, encompassing the needs of the entire Indigenous family and extended community. An Indigenous wraparound approach led by Indigenous communities must be adopted. With that, I thank you for listening to me speak to the foundations and the solutions and issues with regards to post-secondary education. I'll now pass it off to Robert to facilitate the questions and comments. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bradley. That was very, very interesting. And, I'm really amazed at those numbers and shocked by the barriers that the community is facing. There's like an urgent need for the government of Canada to act on some of these solutions that you have suggested in there. We now have some time, as Bradley just mentioned, we have some time for some questions and answers to our speakers. We'd also appreciate hearing from any of the participants who would like to talk about their experience with education here in Canada or in their own communities in other parts of the world, and hear any best practices of things that may have worked in their community that were really helpful in moving the agenda forward. And as a reminder, you may raise your hand function and type your question in the Q&A if you wish. So I guess to begin, I'll say again, it's a real pleasure to have National Chief Bradley and Chief Augustine and Chief Cooper is on with us today as well. To be here, these people have all worked their entire lives to fight for this cause for non-status, not reserved peoples, and I'm so appreciative of that fact. And they have so much to offer. So if there's questions out there, we'd love to hear them. But I could probably start, Bradley, a theme that came up during your presentation today was discrimination. And being that your people are being denied, our people are being denied access to educational supports available to other Indigenous peoples, can you tell us some specific examples of the impact of this exclusion for the community? What do you hear from youth and your own community about what barriers they're facing?
Absolutely. That is a great question. When it comes to youth, time and time again, my involvement with the National Youth Council with Congressional Peoples, I've been involved for 12 years going on now. Soon I might not have the label of youth, but time and time again, there are 3 issues that continue to crop up across every time we talk about what needs to change in Canada. First is we need better access to our culture and our resources. Second is we need better access to mental health supports. And third, every time, is we need better access to post-secondary education and employment opportunities. When it comes to youth, we're growing out of our age where we're reliant and dependent on others. We're becoming self-sustaining, self-determining. We're starting to make our own place in the world. And the foundation of that, the reality of it, is that it needs to have education and employment to begin your journey in your own adulthood. With that, I've heard from many of the youth that they simply weren't even set up for post-secondary education before they even reached grade 12 at the time where they could pursue it. For those lucky few, which may not be a high number, who even reach grade 12, who then look to pursue otherwise, they get denied and turned around everywhere because they don't fit within the government of Canada's definition of an Indigenous person who is eligible for some of these programs and support services. I have Indigenous youth who say that they're Métis, but they're not Métis from a recognized Métis community. To some, as simply checking a box saying you're self-identifying is enough to get you in the door. For others, it's not enough to get your full tuition paid for. And for Indigenous peoples, family and youth who live intergenerational poverty, their families not having obtained post-secondary education themselves, this is the opportunity that could change their lives. And they're simply said, no, because we don't recognize that you're Indigenous deserving of this opportunity. And it's a heartfelt story I hear time and time again from many of our Indigenous youth. And the reality is that it comes down to, we want to support these Indigenous youth, but where do we get the money? Where's the funding? And to that, my simple response is, what is the value of an Indigenous youth getting that education? We're not a liability to Canada. We are a benefit. We are support. We have so much Indigenous knowledge and culture, things that we can provide. We are a benefit. And it's just a matter of time until Canada recognizes that and stops putting these barriers in face for our Indigenous youth and our Indigenous students to be able to access their full potential. Thank you.
Thanks, Bradley. I appreciate the response. It is very concerning. And the whole, I love the title that you gave the presentation, creating an underclass, and that the distinction being made between Indigenous peoples here in Canada means that we are creating an underclass of Aboriginal peoples, and that group of Aboriginal peoples that aren't as important, aren't as enriched, aren't as supported, aren't as included in Canada as the others. And so, you really highlighted that really well for us. So thank you for that response. I had mentioned that that Chief Lorraine Augustine is with us today, and I don't need to tell anybody who knows this organization how long she's been involved with us and how important her perspective on the history of this organization is. And so, during the National Chief's Remarks today, Chief Augustine, he talked about fighting back, and he mentioned the Daniels decision. Can you tell us a bit more about Harry Daniels and the legal battles we have with Canada?
Sure can, and thank you, Robert. Well, it goes back to 2000, and actually it goes back even further than that. Harry Daniels, back in the early 80s, went around and he was responsible for the change in the Constitution of Canada. He went around, I don't want to tell my age, but I was around and I was at those constitutional talks that Harry Daniels was going around doing across the country. And he was a fighter. He wanted to make sure that the non-status Métis were part of the Canadian Constitution. So Harry Daniels is responsible for changing that Constitution back in the early 80s. So Canada changed the Constitution, and Harry was quite happy. He was he was part of the Native Council of Canada back then. And I can remember, he thought, oh my God, what a fight, but we did it. And that was his words, we did it, we got through. So as time went on, the Constitution of Canada changed. Aboriginal peoples was defined as Indian, Inuit, Métis. So the years passed, the years passed. In terms of the off-reserve Indigenous peoples, we still weren't being included. You know, we get a little bit here and there. We went to a few, you know, sat at the tables with some of the provincial ministers and the Prime Minister, but Canada never really recognized us as Indians. So Harry thought, you know what? I'm not dealing with this anymore. He brought it to the board, and at the time I was a board member of the Congress. This was back in 2000. And he said, you know what? He said, the Constitution change didn't do a whole lot for us. He said, I'm going to go, him and a few other people, including his son, Gabriel. They said they're going to file a case against Canada, and specifically Department of Indian Affairs at the time. He decided, you know, Section 9124, Indians and land reserved for Indians. So he said, they've done nothing for us. It's time that we move further. So he launched Harry Daniels, and I think it was Leah Gardner, Gabriel. Now I'm going by memory, guys. So, but there was a few that said, yeah, I'll take it on. I'll take it on. So Harry Daniels filed it in 2000. It took 16 years for the Supreme Court of Canada to make a decision on the Daniels case. The Supreme Court of Canada says, yes, Métis and non-status are Indians under Section 9124. So that was another win for the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. To this day, 6 years later, we are still fighting the government on accepting what the highest court in this country acknowledged, that we are Indians. So that's a little bit of background on Daniels. And as Robert said, I've been around for 40 some years. I'm not going to say how long, but over 40 years. And I know the struggles that we've had in everything, and especially the education part. So I'll stop there and I'll answer any other questions that you may have. But that gives you a good background of the Daniels and how it came about.
Thank you so much, Chief Augustine, sorry. I guess that really runs into the next question, you know, why this big legal battle? Why was it so important for the court to actually, you know, confirm that, you know, non-status and Métis were Indigenous peoples? And like, as you noted in the presentation, there's a big difference in funding being provided to unreserved Indigenous peoples and that of the growing Indigenous population of reserve, with more than 80% of Aboriginal peoples now living off reserve. Can you tell me how the funding gap impacts your organization and their ability to provide services to their people, or even how it affects you? And this is a general question, like Bradley or Chief Augustine. I know Chief Cooper, you're here today as well, if you'd like the answer, or National Chief St. Pierre. You know, like, what impact is it having on the organizations to be able to get work done?
I can start off if everyone's okay with that. The legal battle, we won, of course. As I said earlier, it impacts us because the Canadian government still refuses to acknowledge that we're Indians. And when the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples won this court case, unfortunately, Canada only recognizes 3 national organizations, and I'm not going to name them. But out of those 3 national organizations, one of them jumped on the bandwagon. They represent maybe 4 provinces of our constituency, which is the off-reserve non-status Métis. They got education funding. They will fund, and of course, this is because of the Daniels case, they will fund an individual student up to $50,000 per year if they're taking a executive or higher up level of education, they will fund up to $90,000 a year. What's our non-status constituency getting? Zero. Zero. The Congress was the one that fought for 16 years to prove to this government through the highest court that we are Indigenous or Indian under the Constitution. So it has a major, major impact on the education. Not only is the court case a challenge, but the Indian Act, colonial policy, is another challenge. And how it affects my constituency and my people that I fight for. If you're a status and you are a member of a band, 633 bands in this country, you can get funding for education if you live on that federal created Indian Act reserve. If you don't live on that reserve, then you go to the Department of Indian Affairs, which is now, I guess, ISC, and you can apply for funding. But I'll tell you, the funding is very, very limited. And again, I'm only talking about a status who lives off the reserve. A non-status has nothing. They have nowhere to turn for their education. I'll give you my own personal example. Growing up, as part of the living off the reserve, I've never lived on a reservation. My grandmother refused, and I grew up with her. She refused to live on a reservation. So growing up, because of residential schools, we moved a lot. So I never had a chance to say that I went to school because I moved 3 times a year because she was afraid that the Indian agents would come and take me away to residential school. So my education wasn't the greatest growing up because I changed schools so much. But as I became an adult, I thought, okay, well, I need an education. So I went back to school. I had to work nights, weekends, do waitressing, whatever I could do to pay for my schooling. Now, my brother, who's a status Indian, he married a non-Indigenous woman. She became an Indian, and she had her education paid for. While I had to struggle to pay for mine because I married a non-Indigenous man. I was ousted. I was taken off the list. I was no longer an Indian in the eyes of the government. I struggled for my education. And you know what? Unfortunately, that is still an issue because some of our children and our grandchildren aren't eligible to be registered. But if it's on the male side prior to 1985, you could become an Indian through marriage. And my sister-in-law had her whole 3 years education paid for, 4 years. While I struggled to try and pay for mine. So that's how one of the examples on how the Canadian government is treating its off-reserve, non-status Métis and Southern Inuit people when it comes to education. It's really sad that they don't even listen to the highest court of the country. So that's one example. I'll let someone else say something.
Thank you so much, Chief Augustine. That was wonderful. Very, very nice. Bradley, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Certainly. There is little I can expand upon Chief Augustine's amazing example that she's provided, but perhaps another angle I would like to share is with the government of Canada, they are the ones who set the examples for how all Canadian citizens and Canadian organizations interact with Indigenous peoples. Though it's not directly under their control and not directly their responsibility, the academic institutions that our students attend take the example that Canada sets. So when Canada does not recognize us as Indigenous peoples, when they don't consult and collaborate with us, academic institutions are watching that. I applaud academic institutions that are trying to attract Indigenous students, that are creating Indigenous safe spaces, that are creating Indigenous curriculums, and even entire Indigenous degrees. But many of those efforts are done with Indigenous peoples who are not represented by CAP and our constituents. And so they don't reflect our values and our practices. So this isn't something that is the responsibility of the federal government, but they set that example. They set that precedent, and its impacts go beyond just what the federal government has control over to every Indigenous person, every citizen of Canada, every academic institution. On a personal note, I still get questions every day or every once in a while on if I pay my taxes. That is the failure of the Canadian government to do its just service to Indigenous peoples. And they need to change how they interact with and how they communicate their partnership with Indigenous peoples. And as Lorraine said, that began with Constitution talks. It continued with Daniel's decision, and they continue to fail to uphold what the highest Supreme Court in Canada has mandated that they must. So that's what I would like to add.
All right, thank you, Bradley. Thank you so much for that. Another question that comes to mind is, Canada has focused a lot on this idea of reconciliation and reconciliation with all Indigenous peoples. And from your perspective, is this process working for our communities, for you and your communities? Have you been able to build a relationship with any levels of government or sectors of society, like the private sector even, in this whole concept of reconciliation? Do you think it's really working here in Canada? And that's open to anybody who would like to share.
Sure, I'd like to share. It's not pretty. Canada says that they want to reconcile with all the Indigenous peoples. The unfortunate part is they're leaving out over 70% of the Indigenous peoples in this country. They provide lip service, and I'm being very nice about it. They tell us what we want to hear. They'll talk to us. But since the Daniels, the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, if you don't mind me saying, National Chief, we signed a political accord. It's been since 2018. Here it is, 4 years almost. We get a little bit of crumbs for capacity building. But can I honestly say that they are reconciling with the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples and its affiliates? I have to say no. We were supposed to, through our political accord, look at policy, talk to us about the legislation and how it affects our people. I have not seen that yet. They talk about, we do have political tables, and our youth, Bradley, sits on one of the education ones. But again, they don't want to move any further. I do not call that real reconciliation. Lip service is not reconciliation. Reconciliation should be, we should be at every table. Anything, whether it's our education, whether it's our housing, whether it's our employment and training, whether it's our health, that all affects all Indigenous peoples. So you can't be proud Canadian and say, we reconcile with all Indigenous peoples. That's a lie. And I'm not afraid to call and tell them they're lying to us. They're lying to the United Nations. They're lying to the individual Indigenous peoples like me, you, National Chief, our elders, our youth. That's not reconciliation. We're not part of. We get crumbs, or we're an afterthought. I don't want to be an afterthought. Harry Daniels didn't fight to be an afterthought. He fought that we are recognized. So No, reconciliation has done absolutely nothing for the off-reserve, non-status, or the Métis or the Inuits. So that's my 2 cents, Roberts.
Well, powerful statement, Chief Augustine, and really thank you for your honesty today. It's really appreciated. I don't know if National Chief or National Youth Bradley would like to comment on that.
Yeah, I'll speak a little bit on that. Lorraine is right. 6 years ago, when the Prime Minister came in, he said he was going to reconcile with all Aboriginal organizations. And with our understanding, all meant there are 5 national organizations. And to date, that man has not talked to us anyway. We've sent letters after letters and he will not respond. Or if he does respond, it's because he'll say, I don't have time. Don't have time for you. But I'll guarantee you, the other 3 national organizations, I'll bet you $1 he's making time for them. And, just like I think we talked a while back there, with the way the Indians talk, he talked with forked tongue. He doesn't, he talks to certain people one way, and with us, he doesn't, basically he never talks at all. And just to touch on back on the education, Robert, one of the big things that I have a problem with the education, how can I stand in front of, this has been going on for about 4 years with me on my side when I was the chief of Ontario, is how can I stand in front of my youth and say to my youth, no, you can't get education because you're a distinction-based approach. And, that has happened. And they kind of looked at me and they say, what do you mean distinction-based? I'm Métis or I'm non-status. Yes, we know you are, except for the government doesn't accept that. You have to belong to a certain organization in order to get your education. But I'll tell you one thing, and I'm kind of glad that Bradley's here. Between him and I and the rest of our board, we're going to fight this. This education it's our livelihood. We've got kids that want to go and further their education, whether it be lawyers, doctors, whatever the case may be. They deserve that opportunity. And as long as I'm in office, I'll have the backing of our board and our youth to fight this right to the end. And like Lorraine said, we're just getting crumbs. It almost seems like, oh, we'll give them a couple $1,000s here, a couple $1,000s there. That'll keep them quiet for a little bit. That's not the way it's going to be. We want to be treated equally. We want to be on the same playing field as everybody else. And that's all we want. We don't want to take away from our brothers and sisters on the other 3 groups. We just want to be treated equally and have the same opportunity that they have. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, National Chief. That's really sad, but I also feel really hopeful that, with a strong board, and we've heard some strong voices here today, that we will get success and that you will be successful in that, and then our kids maybe actually be able to get that higher level of education that they deserve. Today, it feels like we're working for someone else instead of working for ourselves. And our kids need the choice to be able to say, I want to be a lawyer or a doctor. Today, they don't have that choice. It's whatever skill the labor market tells them that they should be doing, and that's the only thing they can access. And so, really powerful words here today. So I really appreciate it. I'd like to again ask one more question, possibly, and I don't see any from the audience. I'm not sure, Jessica, you could double check for me. But much of your presentation spoke about policies that have been oppressive, that have led to the marginalization of the community. And this has been happening for over 100 years, and you all are very familiar with it for sure. How has this had an impact on our ability to maintain, or your ability to maintain culture? And how have off-reserve and non-status communities in particular managed to be so resilient in the face of so much colonial policy? And so I open it up to anybody. How have we been able to maintain, or you've been able to maintain your culture in the face of all this adversity?
Thank you, Robert. I'll take a first try at the question.
Thanks, Bradley.
When it comes to Indigenous peoples, especially within the First Nations, there's this concept of looking ahead 7 generations. And to me, it's thanks to that idea of it being so future oriented, big picture, looking to what is the result 7 generations ahead of today, that we're able to withstand the resilience of everything that we've been put through in the current present. When you look back to the constitutional talks that we had to fight for, look back to the 60s scoop, the residential schools, the white papers that spoke about killing the Indian and the Indian. You look towards even more recently, the Daniels decision and how we continue to be negatively impacted, and how Canada has a focus on only a select number of Indigenous peoples to recognize. You can see time and time again this idea that Canada does not want to address the Indian problem. And it is a problem in the eyes of the government, not a solution, but a problem. And that's always been the stance that we've had. It has unfortunately had to be confrontational. But to that end, it doesn't need to be, nor do I think many Indigenous people do see it as confrontational. To many, this is a nation-to-nation talk, a government-to-government talk. We have been and always will be our own independent peoples. We have our own communities. We have our own support systems. That will never be broken down or destroyed. Even if the government of Canada refuses to call us Indigenous, we are Indigenous. Nobody will define that for us other than ourselves. And it's through these repeated endeavors, this looking ahead towards the future, that we gain our resilience, that we know that at the end of the day, the government of Canada will eventually realize it. It's not a question of if, but a question of when. And we need to continue that fight, and we always will continue that fight, because we know this is what we need to do now, here in the present, for our great, 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 great grandchildren of the future. We're fighting not for ourselves, but for them. And that's what is keeping myself, and I'm sure many of the Indigenous people across Canada, continuing to advocate in the way that we do. Thank you.
Thank you, Bradley. Anyone else would like to contribute to that question?
Thank you, Robert. I will. I always got my 2 cents in, right? You know, it's funny, back in 1920, the first superintendent of Department of Indian Affairs was Duncan Scott. When Indian Affairs was created, you know, it's funny, and I'll read an excerpt from that. He says, and he stated very clearly, he said, "Our object is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and that there is no Indian question and no Indian department. That is the whole object of that bill." So you look back, you talk about resilience. Hey, take a look across the country. How many Aboriginal people are there? And I always say, you know what, his little scheme didn't work, did it? Just because the non-status don't fit within the colonial policy, we're still here. We signed treaties. There was no on reserve, off reserve. There was no ban. Matter of fact, there wasn't even any chiefs when some of the treaties were signed in Eastern Canada and Western Canada, for that matter. So I would have to say our fight is strong. So yeah, we are resilient, and we will continue to be that, and we will continue to follow the legacy of our leaders like Harry Daniels, who put us where we are today, and we're still fighting the fight. God bless his soul. He may be gone, but the fight's going to continue for the off reserve.
Thank you, Chief Augustine. Thank you, Bradley. You know, your words give me so much hope that there will be a brighter future for our communities, and I truly believe that, and I believe that because of the work that you've all done, National Chief, and everybody, and it's just amazing. Like, I'm so inspired by the work that you do every day, and like I said, just very hopeful. I don't see any more questions, and I certainly don't have any more for you right now. So I would like to call on the National Chief. Well, first, I would like to thank everyone for your participation and your beautiful words today. Like I said, they're inspiring, and just really thought-provoking, and I learned so much. And I'm sure everybody who attended did as well. So my miigwech and nakalmeek to everybody who spoke here today. And so I'd like to call on the National Chief just to give us a couple of closing remarks before we end the presentation. National Chief.
Yes, I want to thank Bradley and Lorraine for being here by my side to help us with this event. And we had some good information, especially the part where our resilience comes from. Think of that 51 years ago, and not one day has come forward that we never stopped fighting. I wasn't there 50 years ago, but I come on board when I was 25 years old, and I've never stopped fighting. Stuff that we're doing today was fighting, 40 years ago. We're still fighting over the same thing. But we will continue on fighting because this is just the way we are. It's in our blood to fight. And that's exactly what the government's going to get, is as long as we have strong people behind us and strong people to lead, there's going to always be a fight, and we'll always be in the forefront of whatever we need to do for our people. And again, I'd like to thank everybody for being here, and hopefully we'll have a good the rest of the day, be a good day for everybody. Thank you very much, Robert.
Excellent. Thank you, Elder Diane and National Chief, for your closing remarks. And I especially like to thank everybody who attended as participants today and took some time to listen to our issues of concern. I hope you carry it back to whatever people need to hear our message, and hopefully it will help. So thanks for everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.